In today, we're going to take a look at westward expansion in the 1840s in the U.S. and a term known as manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the idea that it's the destiny of the United States to expand westward, a destiny that comes from God. It's an idea that started in the 1840s and will carry through for several decades in U.S. history. It's a belief that the United States should expand from coast to coast, from the Atlantic to the Pacific. And eventually it will be used to justify expansion elsewhere, possibly into Mexico, into Native American territories, later on overseas even. Apart from the very lofty ideas of manifest destiny, that it was our destiny from God to expand, there were also some very practical reasons for migrating west and expanding the United States. First of all, as the population grew in the east, the abundant land in the west was very tempting. As settlers would move west and establish a new area, they were eventually followed by merchants who would provide them with the various supplies that they needed. So it created new markets for American goods throughout North America. Also, the Panic of 1837, which was an economic depression that took place, encouraged people to look for other opportunities in the West. People had lost jobs, had struggled to earn an income and support their families, so the opportunities that the West offered were especially enticing to lots of people. As American settlers moved west, inevitably they were going to end up interacting with Native Americans that already lived in the western part of North America. These interactions led to treaties like the Treaty of Fort Laramie. The Treaty of Fort Laramie protected Native American lands in Wyoming, a little bit in Montana and parts of South Dakota and Nebraska, even in our own area. In exchange for allowing settlers safe passage through Native American lands were guaranteed secure. Basically, we wouldn't take those Native American lands. It also allowed the U.S. to build forts and roads to allow settlers to travel more easily, and also to provide them with places to refuel on supplies and places to rest on their journey. There were a number of trails west. We're going to look at a few of the more significant ones. One of the first trails west to develop was the Santa Fe Trail. It went from Independence, Missouri to Santa Fe, New Mexico, or what's now New Mexico. It was a Mexican province at the time. And it was a trade route mainly for fur traders, and there were some ugly trips along the Santa Fe Trail. The passage into Mexico was only open for certain portions of the year. So fur traders would gather at the border, wait for the border to be open and for them to be allowed in, and then it was an all-out race to Santa Fe. If they could get there quicker, they'd be able to sell their items for a better price. If you were the last one to make it to Santa Fe, your furs sold for very little. So it led to shootouts between fur traders. It led to fur traders breaking the rules and trying to sneak into Mexico before the border was officially open. Some ugly early Wild West showdowns on the Santa Fe Trail. The Oregon Trail was a trail for settlers, those looking to actually settle in the West. It was started by Methodist missionaries, and it too started in Independence, Missouri, and traveled to Portland, Oregon. The Mormon Trail, which started in Nauvoo, Illinois, and went to Salt Lake City, Utah, was, of course, started by Mormons. It was to escape persecution in Illinois. Their leader, their founder, Joseph Smith, had actually been attacked and killed by a mob. So they were led by Brigham Young to Salt Lake City, where they would be able to live, hopefully, free of persecution. Much of the land in the West that American settlers would be traveling towards and traveling into was not actually the possession of the United States. Much of it belonged to Mexico. Mexico had just recently gained its independence from Spain in 1821. It's the first European colony after the United States in the Americas to gain their independence. And after gaining their independence, they tried to improve their economy in Mexico and in some of the provinces and territories, like Texas. So to try to improve their economy, they promoted trade between Texas and the United States. And they even invited American settlers to settle on their land very inexpensively. Eventually, there were more Anglo-Americans, or white Americans, living in Texas than the native Tejanos. As more and more Anglo-Americans moved into Texas, there were more and more disputes between Anglos and Tejanos. Those disputes included differences over language. The Tejanos believed that the Anglo immigrants should speak Spanish, not English. Kind of ironic that many people today believe that Mexican immigrants to the United States should learn to speak English, but at one point in time it worked the other way. There were disputes over slavery. Many of the immigrants from the United States into Texas were from the South, and they wanted to bring their slaves into Texas. Slavery at the time was illegal in Mexico and in Texas, which was of course part of Mexico. So after many disputes and after massive immigration by Anglo-Americans, Mexico closed its borders, would not allow any more immigrants in, and taxed any goods imported from the U.S. So this affected those immigrants from the United States living in Texas that were trying to receive goods from the United States. However, in 1835, there were approximately 1,000 Anglos immigrating into Texas every month, even after the borders were closed. So even though Mexico had closed the borders, it was difficult for them to police such a huge border. Over time, the disputes between Anglos and Tejanos and Anglos and the Mexican government continued to escalate, and they came to a head at the Alamo, which is in present-day San Antonio. The Alamo was a missionary and a fort. American and Mexican rebels in Texas set up to defend the Alamo. After a 12-day siege, the siege ended when all of the 187 Americans in the Alamo were killed by Mexican soldiers. Shortly thereafter, Texas would declare its independence and become an independent nation, and eventually Texas would be annexed as a state into the United States in 1845. Soon after Texas gained its independence and was annexed by the United States, there was a push for war with Mexico, a push to gain more land. That idea of manifest destiny had escalated to war, to fighting to claim new land. This war was encouraged or promoted by the President of the United States, James K. Polk. He pushed for war in order to gain what would become New Mexico and California, which at the time were Mexican territories. At first, the U.S. tried to buy New Mexico and California, but Mexico rejected the offer. And not everyone in the United States supported this idea. It was mostly Southerners and Westerners that promoted or were in favor of a war with Mexico to gain more territory. Many Northerners, though, opposed the idea of a war with Mexico because they accused Southerners and pro-slavery people of trying to gain land south of that Missouri Compromise line to expand slavery in the United States. The war officially starts when the United States sent a military expedition into California, which was part of Mexico at the time. There were, however, a lot of American settlers already living in California. There were some disputes over whether or not they would claim their independence. But the war begins when, after this U.S. military expedition is sent into California, the Mexican army crossed the Rio Grande into California, and in the first battle killed 11 U.S. soldiers. As we saw in our reading yesterday, Polk declared that Mexican troops had entered into the United States. Again, California was at the time part of Mexico. In the war, the United States won pretty convincingly. They didn't lose a major battle throughout the war. They captured New Mexico, California, and even marched all the way to Mexico City. And by capturing Mexico City, were able to force the Mexican government to sign a treaty to end the war. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo marked the official end to the war. And with the treaty, the United States agreed to pay $15 million to Mexico for California, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and parts of Arizona, Colorado, and even all the way up into Wyoming. $15 million, if you remember, that was the same amount the United States paid for the Louisiana Territory more than 40 years earlier. This treaty set nearly the present-day boundaries of the 48 states, the continental states. There are a few small changes that will take place over the next few decades. And it has a massive impact on both Mexico and the United States. During the course of the war, Mexico lost approximately 50,000 men. We don't know exactly how many. A number of them actually died from illnesses and not from wounds suffered in battle. But 50,000 men, or about, is a very significant number for a relatively short war. Mexico also lost approximately half of its territory. So 25 years after achieving their independence from Spain, their country has just been reduced by half. The United States increased its size by 1/3, and again, this pretty much created the boundaries, the present-day boundaries of the continental United States. There will be a few changes that take place. The United States lost only about 13,000 men, and actually 11,000 of those died from diseases. So only 2,000 U.S. men actually died from battle, from the wounds that they received in battle. It was a major victory for the United States and would open the door to massive westward expansion, which we'll be talking about later.